We've sent rovers to Mars, probes to Pluto, and satellites into geosynchronous orbit. But it was too long ago that even sending a spacecraft into low Earth orbit was an almost unimaginably difficult task. It took the best part of 2 decades for us to get to where we are today. And it all started with a pair of rivals trying to outdo each other in a contest that would change the world. This is the story of the space race, from the end of World War II until the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USA and USSR were locked in a terrifying competition of weapons development and geopolitical one-upmanship. This was the Cold War, each side desperate to prove its superiority, and each side knowing that the other possessed the capability to end the world many times over. It was against this backdrop of mutually assured destruction that the USSR shocked the world on October 4, 1957, when it successfully launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to ever orbit the Earth. For Americans, this was a disaster. The country's first attempt at beating the Soviets into space had failed, and now the Russians had bragging rights. First, they had beaten the US into space, and second, they had beaten the US into orbit. To make matters worse, Sputnik also happened to be carrying a radio beacon which would periodically transmit a sound that Americans quickly dubbed the Soviet beat. To make matters even worse, the rocket that launched Sputnik was a type of intercontinental ballistic missile. In other words, the same type of rocket that could deliver a nuclear warhead. Suddenly, America's worst fears about Soviet capabilities were realized. Not only could the Soviets launch missiles across continents, but they could do so undetected. America's ability to respond would be severely compromised. Worst-case scenario, the entire world order could be turned upside down. In response to this perceived threat, the US government quickly ramped up its own space program. Just 4 years later, this effort culminated in Project Mercury. On April 12, 1961, a Vostok 1 rocket lifted off from the Soviet Union, carrying cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit. He became the first human to journey into space. 4 orbits later, Vostok 1 re-entered the atmosphere and parachuted into the frigid waters of the Barents Sea. Moments later, a helicopter arrived to extract Gagarin, who would go on to become a Soviet national hero. But he might have been the last if the US had managed to beat them to the punch. With their first manned mission, the Soviets had once again beaten the Americans into something else. The pressure was now on. America needed a response, and it needed it fast. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American to reach space aboard a Freedom 7 capsule. But his flight lasted just 15 minutes. He was a suborbital tourist, not a true astronaut. That distinction would go to John Glenn, who orbited the Earth 3 times in 1962. But neither of these men made it to space without being propelled by a rocket. Developed by German scientists captured during World War II, and both of their flights were completed with rudimentary spacecraft guided by analog computers. Meanwhile, the Soviets were making massive strides. By 1963, they were sending 2 men into orbit for 3 days. But as far as everyone knew, they were still using the same rockets and computers. So it came as a complete shock when on June 3, 1963, the Soviets launched a 3-man spacecraft called Voskhod 1 into orbit. Shocking because not only did it have no connection to the previous capsules, but it was also launched atop a completely new type of rocket. For the Americans, the implications were clear. If the Soviets could make such a huge leap forward in just 2 years, then they might actually have a chance of winning the space race. America's lead had evaporated. President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation. He outlined his vision for the future. An American crew would orbit the moon and return safely to Earth before the end of the decade. The Apollo program was born. On July 20, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Canaveral, carrying astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. But after 4 days in space, the lunar module carrying Armstrong and Aldrin separated from the command module where Collins was. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon. The Cold War would continue for another 2 decades. But from that point forward, the narrative changed. America had reclaimed the mantle of technological superiority. Their victory in the space race inspired generations of scientists, engineers, and explorers. And it all started with a pair of rivals trying to outdo each other. For more videos of space stories, stay tuned.